I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
On April 4th, 1968, while standing on the balcony of a hotel room, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot.
We have information that King has been shot at the Lorraine.
When is the Lorraine area report of a shooting?
Again, we have information that the shot came from a brick building directly west.
And the subject ran south on Main Street.
Still with a weak pulse, he was taken to a nearby hospital where doctors tried to save his life. However, their efforts were in vain. The Reverend, an activist, defender of the rights of African Americans, died, shocking the entire world.
Martin Luther King, 20 minutes ago, died.
The call for justice was not long in coming. Immediately, an international search began to find the killer. Everyone wanted to find the person responsible for the assassination, but over time, it began to be suspected that the intention of some was not to obtain justice, but something much more sinister. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will analyze in detail the death of one of the most revolutionary men in the history of the United States. And we will also try to answer the question, who was the real murderer of Martin Luther King? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began his activism for civil rights at a very young age. Already in the 1950s, when he was just over 20 years old, he organized and led strikes and boycotts, demanding the attainment of basic rights for the African American population in the United States. These demands were characterized by maintaining a peaceful nature, even when opponents resorted to violent methods to try to provoke or intimidate King's followers. Thanks to some of these protests, certain racist practices, such as segregation in buses, restaurants, and some schools, were declared illegal. Although King was arrested numerous times and even suffered an assassination attempt, he continued to lead these movements. In 1964, thanks in part to his efforts, the Civil Rights Act was passed, which allowed African-descended people greater access to voting throughout the country. But despite always maintaining his pacifist stance, the speaker's speeches caused certain sectors of the American government to look at him with suspicion. When he spoke out against the Vietnam War and certain capitalist practices, many of his detractors called him a communist or even a Soviet agent. It is not surprising then that King, like many other leaders of social movements, was under constant surveillance by the FBI, who considered him an enemy of the state. This led to the fact that after his assassination in 1968, a large group of people became suspicious of the official version given in the news. They couldn't help but wonder, who was really responsible for Martin Luther King's death?
On his journey of changing the social landscape of America, Martin Luther King accrued many enemies. Motives for his death were palpable throughout America, from the far-right supremacist groups, like the KKK, to the political establishment.
After King was shot, authorities investigated the room from which the shot had come. There they found fingerprints that matched those of a career criminal. This was James Earl Ray, who had already spent time in prison for armed robbery and fraud, among other crimes. During his last sentence, he managed to escape and had been on the run from authorities ever since. With this information, a worldwide search began for the suspect.
The young white male, well-dressed, possibly in a late model white Mustang, went north on Main Street 610.
The hunt ended 2 months after the murder. On June 8, 1968, James Earl Ray was captured at a London airport while trying to get a one-way ticket to Angola, South Africa, or Rhodesia, today known as Zimbabwe. It was suspected that he had planned to join the strongly racist militias in those countries as a mercenary. After his extradition to the United States, he was formally charged with the assassination of Martin Luther King. On March 10, 1969, facing a possible death penalty and following the advice of his lawyer, he pleaded guilty. Thus, the case seemed to be coming to an end. But just 3 days later, he retracted his confession, declaring that he was only a scapegoat. However, it was too late for him. The judges sentenced him to 99 years in prison.
6,000 FBI agents, together with police from over 100 countries, have been looking for Ray in the 2 months that have elapsed since Dr. King's murder. And now, The trail ends here at Cannon Row Police Station.
After his conviction, James Earl Ray learned that even if he went to trial, he could not be sentenced to the electric chair under the laws of the state where he was convicted. After retracting his guilt, he began to say that while he was not the one who pulled the trigger, he may have been involved in the murder without knowing it, suggesting the existence of a conspiracy. He testified that a mysterious man named Raoul had approached him in 1967 and was the one who guided him through all the steps that led to the assassination. According to him, he ordered him to buy the murder weapon and also to rent the room from which the fatal bullet was fired. But this story was full of inconsistencies. Ray contradicted himself more than once in his physical description of Raoul, and there was not a single witness who could testify that he saw the two men together. Nothing seemed to support this theory of a conspiracy against Dr. King. However, in 1997, his son Dexter managed to interview the alleged killer and asked him without any preamble if he was responsible. When Ray denied it, Dexter said that he, along with his entire family, believed him. This statement shocked the entire world. But then, who really was the killer? Who was really in charge of organizing one of the biggest assassinations of the decade?
Over the decades, the theories presented have raised serious doubts whether Ray was the man that actually pulled the trigger. His criminal background, far-right leanings, and subsequent escape in 1967, by hiding in a trunk transporting bread into the prison, made him the ideal patsy.
For Martin Luther King Jr.'s family, the main suspicions fell on agents of the U.S. government itself. From the beginning of his activism, the doctor had made numerous enemies in these organizations. John Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI at the time, had called him the most notorious liar in the country and had ordered him to be kept under surveillance from 1956 onwards. It was also known that the intelligence agency listened to the calls he received and tried to brand him as a communist in order to turn the local population against him. Some members of this agency went so far as to say that the FBI was already under suspicion for the murder of Malcolm X, another activist for the rights of African Americans, who died in 1965 in suspicious cases even today. Martin Luther King's opposition to the Vietnam War, which in 1968 was at its most intense, earned him the hatred of the then U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson. The conflict was resisted by a growing part of the population, and the preacher's words only fueled calls for peace. To him, the conflict was a perfect example of American hypocrisy. African Americans were good enough to go to die in a faraway Asian country, but not to have the rights of their white compatriots. At the same time, he strongly criticized the imperialist policies of the United States and accused them of committing a massacre against Vietnamese children. His statements turned the press against him, which began to circulate rumors of King's affiliation with the Communist Party, which he flatly denied. Enemies kept appearing, but no threat deterred him from continuing his protests.
If you aren't out within 10 days, you and your family will be killed. Now, in Montgomery, our home was bombed twice. Today, we still confront threats through telephone calls and through the mail.
It was then that the FBI sought to attack from another angle, attempting to defame the activist's private life. Hoover declared that Martin Luther was a complete degenerate who hid his dark sexual desires under a facade of civility. There was talk of orgies organized by him, involving prostitutes and homosexuals, and in which delegates of his organization participated. The FBI used its resources to make the press believe these rumors, but even so, King was not intimidated. Hoover's hatred, however, knew no bounds.
Hoover had escalated his illegal surveillance of King in the years prior, sending him sex tapes the FBI had filmed along with anonymous threatening letters, calling for him to commit suicide within 34 days, or his image would be ruined with the release of his extramarital affairs.
It was also said that the letter and package were intended to turn his wife Coretta against him in order to publicly discredit their marriage. However, his wife stood by her husband, arguing that the content of the recordings contained only nonsense. This undeniable animosity towards Martin Luther King gives those who believe in James Earl Ray's innocence a clear suspect to point to. It was the FBI itself that investigated King's assassination after it happened. If they were really involved, it would not have been difficult for them to cover their tracks. However, according to conspiracy theories, this agency is only one of those involved in the attack. Another of the accused parties is the police department of Memphis, the city where the attack occurred. Like the FBI, they also had the Reverend under strict surveillance during the months before his death. Some of their officers were able to infiltrate organizations that provided security for King in order to keep an eye on him. On the day of the assassination, the detectives tasked with observing the activist were unexpectedly ordered to return to their station. A few hours later, the fatal shot was fired and Martin Luther King was assassinated. For many, this was done with the intention of clearing the path for the assassin and removing any possible obstacles that could identify the real shooter. Is this a sign that points to police complicity? For many, the answer is clear. But in 1993, an event occurred that made even the most cynical person doubt. A mysterious man named Lloyd Jowers, owner of a place called Jim's Grill, located just below where the fatal bullet was fired, appeared on a news program. There, he claimed to have undeniable information about King's real assassin. When questioned as to why a simple salesman knew so much, he gave a simple reason. He had been a direct accomplice to the attack. But, in his words, he was far from being the only one.
Frank Liberto, a mafia-connected produce dealer associated with Louisiana crime boss Carlos Marcello, delivered $100,000 to Jim's Grill, the back door of which opened onto the thick bushes, where several witnesses claimed the shots originated. In addition to the money, Jowers claims a man named Raul came to see him, delivering a rifle in a case.
Jowers testified with absolute certainty that Ray was merely a scapegoat. According to him, the real killer was a police officer named Earl Clark. Encouraged by these new revelations, and always distrustful of the official version, King's widow Coretta organized a civil trial in 1999. At the trial, Jowers, along with other officers, was accused of having conspired to kill her husband. Over the course of 4 weeks, about 70 witnesses gave their version of events in front of a jury composed of both white and black people. Thousands of documents were produced, each of which proved, according to King's family, James Earl Ray's innocence. After an hour of deliberation, the men and women of the jury unanimously declared that Martin Luther King had been killed by conspiracy. They determined that Officer Clark had pulled the trigger and that he had received help from his fellow police officers and members of the Memphis mob. And although they did not specify which ones, it was clear that certain government agencies were also involved in the crime. Unfortunately for them, since it was a civil trial, it had no real legal value. The version of King's murder with Ray as the only culprit remained the official one, who continued to declare his innocence until the time of his death in 1998. After the trial, many lawyers or journalists launched their own investigations and came to very different conclusions than those of the jury organized by Coretta. For them, Lloyd Jowers invented a fantasy with the sole objective of enriching himself from media attention, exploiting the King family's anguish for his benefit. The testimony of the witnesses was contradictory, and the evidence was inconclusive. However, for Martin Luther's wife and son, justice continues to elude them. In 2027, the transcripts of what was recorded by the FBI microphones will be made public. It may be there that it will be possible to clarify what really happened on that dark and tragic day. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, who do you think was the real killer of Martin Luther King? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more mysterious events that left their mark on history.